Everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is how I sewed up this super basic little dress. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started. Starting with the fabric, this is a viscose jersey. It has stretch in both directions, quite lightweight and flowy, good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my back, my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have the usual sleeve notches and a notch at the fold line, top and bottom. So the first thing to do here is to stabilize the neckline. So I'm using some stretch tape here, and I'm pressing it into place on the right side of the fabric, creating little pleats at the curve, snipping off the excess. So that's that done. So now this piece is ready for its facing. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have a notch on the fold line at the top. In terms of prep work for this one, I want to add a little bit of flat piping to the top and bottom. And for that I'm using this ITY that I had left over from a previous project, and I've just cut myself strips, folded them in half along their length, and now lining up my raw edges and stitching the whole way around at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I've trimmed off the excess and pressed, and this is what I get. Happy with that. And off camera I've given the same treatment to the top edge, just this time I haven't pressed it underneath. So now that that's done, I'm ready to add this piece to my back. So laying it right side of facing to wrong side of back, and stitching here directly through that stitch line you've seen me place on the facing, starting and finishing with a back stitch. So now to help this line nice and flat, I'm just going to cut little triangles at my curves. That just needs a bit of a press. So that's my facing all attached on the back neck. I'll finish that bottom edge a little bit later, but for now this piece is ready to be joined to my front at the shoulder. So this is the left side of my front. I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece and the usual sleeve notch. I've added that same stay tape to the neckline, and just like the back before, I have a facing to add. I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece, and I want to give this piece the same treatment as the back neck facing. So I'm adding 2 strips of the trim along each side. And here, just laying it over the neck, right side of facing to wrong side of neck, and stitching in exactly the same way as before, directly through that line of stitches on the facing. I've given that a press, and this is what I get. I've trimmed off the excess, top and bottom. So now before I can add the right side of my front, I need to take care of its facing too. I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece. I've added that same red trim along both sides. And now just lining it up with the left side of my front, but this time my fabric is right sides together. And stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, again directly through that line of stitches on the facing. So that's my facing for the right and left side all in place. So now on to the right side of my front. I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece, the usual sleeve notch. I've prepped this in exactly the same way as the left side, so I've added that stay tape to the neck. So now that that's done, I'm ready to join this piece to my left side. My fabric is wrong sides together. And stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way along. And I'm joining these pieces together in this specific order so that I can enclose all of my edges on the inside. So you'll see here, if I unfold my two front pieces, all of my raw edges are tucked away underneath the facing and inside, super neat and tidy. So that completes the prep work on the front. So now to join it to the back at the shoulder. Lining up my facing, lining up my edges, and sewing this time on the overlocker. That's how to press. I've ran a couple of hand stitches at each side of the neck just to hold that seam in underneath and help prevent it poking out too much. So now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my facing. So I'm running a line of stitches from the hem the whole way up the facing's edge. I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the red trim. Around the back neck, and finishing at the V on the other side of the front. And once that's at a good press, this is how it looks. Very happy with this. So now to add the sleeves. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, the usual sleeve notches around the sleeve head, and the first thing to do here is to add that same trim right along that bottom edge. So lining up my raw edges the whole way across and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. I've trimmed off the excess. Now before I can add this to the dress, I have one more piece I want to add, and that is this. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern, lining up my edges. My fabric is right sides together, and stitching here just like before, directly through that line of stitches you see me sew whilst attaching the trim. I've ran my edges through the overlocker, pressed that seam in underneath, and while I was at the overlocker I've also ran the hem of my flounce through it, and now that that's done I'm ready to top stitch. So I'm running a line of stitches through the bottom of the sleeve, through that finished and pressed seam allowance in underneath, and I'm about 1 millimetre or 2 away from the red trim. This will just hold the trim in that press position and make sure it doesn't twist or move out of place. So that's all of the prep work complete on my sleeve. Now to add it to the dress. So lining up my shoulder notch, my front notch, my side seam. I'll do exactly the same on the other side and ready to sew. So back to the overlocker again, stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, making tiny little adjustments, trying to ensure that my edges are lined up the whole way around. I've given that a good press. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. My fabric is right sides together. And stitching here from the hem of the dress, the whole way up the side seam, finishing at the hem of the sleeve. I've pressed out my seams, and while I was at the pressing table I've also pressed up the hem of my sleeves, and here just stitching directly through those overlock stitches the whole way around. And once they've had a good press, this is how they look. Happy with that. So I have a flounce to add to the hem here, and I don't want the weight of it stretching out my seam or pulling at anything. So in an attempt to minimize that or eliminate it, I'm adding a little bit of a stabilizer. So I'm just using some woven bias, which I've pressed in half along its length. I'm lining it up on the edge of the hem and stitching the whole way across. So now that I have that little bit of stabilizing tape in place, I'm ready for my flounce. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch to indicate my side seam and a notch at the fold line on the top. And the first thing to do here is to close up that centre back seam. So stitching on the overlocker this time, and off camera I'll also run the entire hem through the overlocker just to tidy it up. So I've pressed out that seam and pressed up my hem in exactly the same way as I did the sleeve earlier. And before adding the flounce to my dress, I just want to stitch up that hem. So sewing again directly through those overlock stitches the whole way around. I've given that a good press. Happy with that. So now this piece is ready to be added to my dress. Lining up my notches, my side seams and centre back, and stitching again on the overlocker the whole way around. Let's add a good press. So now that my flounce is all attached, I just have one final thing to finish this dress, and that is to add some buttons along that centre front. So I'm using just standard little black buttons. I've sewn those on off camera, and now that that's done, this little dress is complete. So I have my sleeves all in place with their trim and flounce detail. I've got that lovely bit of trim right up the front and around the back neck, all nicely stitched into place. My buttons the whole way down the front, and of course that gorgeous flounce at the bottom. And this is how it looks on. So I'm very happy with the detail on this one. I love that red trim and how it shows up that gorgeous mock wrap detail right the whole way down the front and up around the back neck. I love the finish of the sleeve, the length of the sleeve, the length of the skirt and its flounce. And for those of you that are interested in patterning, I've shown how to pattern a flounce in a previous video. I shall leave that linked below. I've also shown how to pattern a knit wrap top. I've used a similar method here, so that might be of use. But anyway, I'm very happy with this one.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!